Good morning, everybody. Happy Monday. We have an amazing show for everybody today. What do we have, Krystal?
Indeed, we do. Lots of interesting things this morning, including some big old news about the lab leak theory, once dismissed and derided as conspiracy, racist, et cetera, et cetera. Now we have a U.S. government report suggesting that is the most likely cause of the coronavirus pandemic. Who could have known it,
No one could
Saagar?
have known. Yeah, never.
Absolute shock. All right, so we'll get to all of that. We also have new developments out of Ohio. Researchers saying that the toxins in the air are worse than what the government is saying. We also have a new report that tens of thousands of animals died within this 5-mile radius. Also much, much worse than initial estimates. So we'll break that down for you. We also have some 2024 news. Shots fired at Ron DeSantis over Ukraine, which is increasingly becoming a critical divide in the Republican primary. So that is really interesting. New numbers on inflation, not good. Not good in terms of inflation, not good in terms of what the Federal Reserve might do about it. And we also have a very controversial monologue over on SNL that we'll break down for you. Excited to have Kevin Roose on the show today. He's the one, I talked about this in a monologue that I did last week, Saagar, while you were out. He had this long conversation with the new Bing chat bot. Sydney?
Yeah.
I should
rename
whatever, revealed to Kevin that this thing called itself Sydney internally, and then also professed its undying love to this journalist. So anyway, we'll talk to him. He's a tech reporter for The Times about what that interaction was like and what he thinks the future of this AI ultimately is. But we wanted to start with this big breaking news regarding lab leak.
Yeah, and a news that should absolutely shock anyone except over at MSNBC. Let's put this up there on the screen. The lab leak, most likely origin of COVID-19 pandemic. The Energy Department now says. Now, why should we care what the Energy Department says? Well, what we found out from this piece, and actually some of us who've been tracking this for quite some time, is that the Energy Department is actually legally entrusted with overseeing safety procedures at a myriad of different labs across the United States. So their estimate of intelligence and how they would interpret it with respect to lab leak was actually quite important. And now they claim, apparently with, quote, low confidence, and an updated document that was delivered to the Director of National Intelligence, Avril, blanking on her name right now.
Avril Haines?
Avril Haines, there we go. Avril Haines, that they have estimated that it is now the most likely origin of the COVID-19 pandemic. This is amid some consternation within the intelligence community. So let's put this up there on the screen from what we know right now. 4 intelligence agencies, remember there are 17, think that COVID spread naturally, lol. The Department of Energy thinks that lab leak was the originator of the COVID-19 pandemic, quote, with low confidence. The most interesting one to me, actually, and they kind of bury the lead here, is that the FBI thinks that the lab leak was the most likely origin with, quote, moderate confidence. Now, the canard that a lot of people are using to try to dismiss this as to why exactly they were wrong in the first place, Krystal, is that, quote, none think it was part of a Chinese bioweapons program. Well, we should remember, like, that was never the original claim, except for one person, Tom Cotton, saying it, I believe, in early of February 2020. But since then, the lab leak theory, hypothesis, has always been that sketchy research was being conducted at the Wuhan lab. This research and its sketchy safety practices were well acknowledged by the U.S. State Department in cables that we have since been open since 2018. It was well known that they were not following proper safety protocols. Then the incredible amount of evidence that we have that November 2019 onwards, clearly something terrible had happened. The original database of the samples was taken off of the Wuhan website in September 2019, has yet to been found as to why. They give no explanation as to why. We know about the, the World Games, that were the World Military Games that were happening there. People can go back and watch 2 years ago now at this point. All the open source searches that we found, a spike for coronavirus symptoms. The fact was also that, the original wet market theory and natural origin, well, the wet market happens to be a place where people shop who work at the lab. So, the original people who left the lab went out there and, of course, spread it to the population, at least, according to this theory. And then we also know that there were people who, at least one or two, up to three, this was back in 2021 that this report came out, that one of those people was known to have contracted it in November of 2019. So all the open source evidence in the world pointed to the lab leak hypothesis. And this has just been a dragging of the feet by the Biden administration. To June of 2021, President Biden said he directed the intelligence community to give him updated documents. And of course, we're only finding out about this because of a leak. Now, to be clear, this is not even really acknowledged publicly yet by the government. This is a classified assessment, a newly classified assessment. And to the extent that this has been happening at all, the reason why is not that they wanted to get to the bottom of it. It's because Republicans in Congress have made a huge stink about how they are going to subpoena all of these documents and do their own internal investigation, and the agencies themselves are getting ready to provide Congress those documents. So their hand was completely forced in even providing this new intelligence estimate. And look, it's not a shocker to anybody who's been following the evidence now for some time. And of course, the real meta takeaway from this is just the evidence has been pointing to this basically since day one. It was completely covered up by Dr. Fauci, by the EcoHealth Alliance, of which we'll talk about in a moment. And really, a lot of apparatchiks in the media who were afraid that, talking about this was racist. And of course, the worst part was that people were taken off of social media, including the Zero Hedge Twitter account. I believe it now has over 1 million followers, as well as numerous others in YouTube and elsewhere who were outright censored on social media platforms, including, this is just speculation, but we covered quite a bit of lab leak over the last 2 years. And we saw, significant ticks down sometimes in the weeks after, especially after, I think we were one of the first people to interview Brett Weinstein after Joe Rogan about the entire thing. I remember that would caused a hell of a lot of consternation, with YouTube and our previous employer. So you can just go into thinking about what the pressures were on at the time not to cover this story.
I mean, I think there's the reason this is still important, just to, back up for a second, is obviously because we don't want to have another pandemic. And it is a live question right now. Actually, the government is weighing whether or not they're going to sort of rein in this gain-of-function research, and if they're going to institute new safety protocols going forward. There were recommendations to do exactly that, but that is still a very live issue. It's still a live issue because freaking EcoHealth Alliance is still getting grants and funding to do similar research, so it's a live issue because of that. But it also was really important because it shows what happens when you have this combination of weird, toxic partisanship, right? There was, Trump out there calling it Kung Flu and whatever, and there was all this concern about anti-Asian American hate. And so when Fauci and other leading scientists basically came down in lockstep and said, no, this is conspiracy, the lab leak is conspiracy, all signs point to a natural origin, well, their media lackeys just jumped right in line and followed suit, as did, the censors at various social media platforms. I think it's really important to remember at the very beginning how this cover-up started. There was a conference call with Fauci and a whole bunch of others where they were kind of going back and forth. All right, how do we think this started? And there was one scientist in particular who said, look, guys, the sequence here is almost identical. Like, you can see how they just inserted this furin cleavage site, and it looks just like previous research that's been done here. So from the beginning, on this call with Fauci, there was an understanding that, it's pretty likely that this was lab leak. Now, not that they were saying it was 100%, but it was like maybe 70-30, maybe 60-40. And that's the conversation that happens privately. Days after is when Peter Daszak, covering his ass, shepherds all of these other scientists into putting out this letter saying, no, it is a natural origin. That's what it is pointing to. And then after that, Fauci's able to go out in public and point to that letter and say, this is what scientists are saying. They're saying it's natural origin. It's basically conspiracy to suggest that it's lab leak and you're racist, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. This is what major media organizations, the New York Times, I think probably was the worst in all of this. And any little bit of evidence that they got that it was natural origin and not lab leak, they would alert people. They would do big front page coverage. They were all in on this. So that's why this is such an important story still, because you can see the way that, reporters who hated Trump for all kinds of, legitimate reasons, the fact that he was suggesting it was lab leak, the fact that Republicans were suggesting it was lab leak, and then you had the scientific establishment in order to protect their grant money, their funding, and cover up any potential involvement that they had in this type of research, they come down on the other side. And that's how you end up with us years later finally getting any glimpse of the reality of the facts and the evidence around what actually happened.
If anyone wants to track what we're saying, I've been covering it now for literally, I think, 3 years now at this point. And what have we learned? Well, okay, we talk about the initial cover-up that you just did with the scientific community. Then we talk about Dr. Fauci using this cover-up of the scientific community. Something that we alleged for a long time is that Dr. Fauci illegally circumvented U.S. government regulations to fund gain-of-function research at the Wuhan lab. This was considered a conspiracy up until a year ago. And then, lo and behold, just a few months ago, put it up there on the screen, January of 2023, the NIH itself, a new report finds, did not follow its own safety protocols in properly tracking the EcoHealth Alliance while it was studying bat coronavirus research at the Wuhan Institute of Virology. The new findings vindicate exactly what we talked about, which is that gain-of-function research under the Obama administration was considered so dangerous and risky for the potential of a lab leak or some sort of other similar type event that the U.S. government was going to stop funding it. Then Dr. Fauci reverses these guidelines in 2017, greenlights $8 million in grants to the EcoHealth Alliance, which continues this virus study at the Wuhan Institute of Virology up until September of 2019 when all these things go black. And why does it matter us for right now? Put this up there, October of 2022. You can see, actually, that's my screenshot of the exact abstract, which is we are providing Fauci on his way out of the National Institute of Health, greenlit an additional grant to the EcoHealth Alliance, continuing to study bat viruses. I'm not exactly sure why. More bat coronavirus research, a $600,000 grant to EcoHealth Alliance, the same organization that funded the Wuhan lab. Now, also with Dr. Peter Daszak, why it matters, and I know much of this can sound as complicated as Watergate or Iraq WMD, but they are important because Peter Daszak was also a part of the initial investigatory group from the World Health Organization that initially determined that there was no lab leak and said it was natural origin, and has the famous interview on 60 Minutes where they said, well, are you just taking the Chinese word for it? And he said, well, what else can we do? I'm like, I don't know, maybe look at your own records. He has a vested monetary interest. And then, even bigger step, let's make sure that this never happens again. Well, what are we doing? Something Josh Rogan has pointed to is that the response from the scientific community, specifically headed by Fauci and the U.S. government, has the Global Virome Project to actually increase billions of dollars in gain-of-function research under the guise of let's never let that next pandemic happen again. Let's try and bioengineer these viruses so that we can create antidotes, cures, vaccines, or whatever in the future. When it seems now at this point, I mean, look, if you are still pumping the natural origin theory, there is almost no evidence to support that. Like, you have been unable to find how some bat miraculously flew 1,000 miles and ended up in the Wuhan lab. Even the Chinese don't even really stick by they don't stick by the wet market theory. They're like, oh, well, something was contaminated along the way, and just stop asking questions about this. All of these intel communities that still assess all of this are based on older intel. You have also the former CDC director under Donald Trump. Remember, he came out and said, I think it came from the Wuhan lab. He was also dismissed then at the point.
And he was shut down of those original meetings when there was open conversation about how this was likely a lab leak and the efforts to make sure that they shepherded everybody out of that direction and towards the natural origin direction. I mean, it really is quite remarkable. And listen, even if you're still like, I don't know, it could be either one. Okay, fair enough. Is it plausible that this escaped from a lab? That's really all you need to know that this research is extremely dangerous. And we need to be asking really hard questions about whether this should continue, what sort of safety procedures should be in place. And by the way, like, we know what the risk was. What have we gotten out of it? I was listening to an old episode of Ryan's podcast, Intercepted. And they were talking, is that what it's called? Intercepted? Deconstructed, there you go. And they were talking about, like, okay, let's say it was the wet market. You have this Institute of Virology right there across the street. If it came from the wet market, you weren't able to stop that? Like, this is supposed to be your whole thing, right? So even if you're buying the natural origin thing, like, what are we getting for this research? It's supposed to be preventing pandemics. Well, it failed. It failed. At the best you can say is it failed, and most likely it actually started the pandemic. So that seems to me pretty strong evidence that we need to dramatically change what we are doing in terms of gain-of-function research.
Yeah, you would think. And let's just not forget, Fauci is probably the #1 person implicated in all of this. He's going out as a hero, but maybe history won't be nearly as kind. Let's just not forget how he tried to play this down at the time. Let's take a listen.
Everything about the stepwise evolution over time strongly indicates that this virus evolved in nature and then jumped species. Fauci added he does not believe another theory that the virus occurred naturally but was accidentally released into the public from a lab in China. Telling Nat Geo that means it was in the wild to begin with. That's why I don't get what they're talking about.
Don't get what they're talking about. He had all the information he knew. Let's remember, January of 2020, he received an email saying that the virus is, quote, not consistent with evolutionary theory. That's what's come out of the Fauci files ever since then. And look, he remains complicit. He remains to say, like, look, it's possible. I never said that it couldn't have come from the lab. Yes, you did. We literally have the evidence right there. And look, the Republicans say that they will investigate, with the House committee. We'll see what they're even able to get their hands on. But at this point, even the coverage of this report, Krystal, it's silence, from most of the mainstream media.
Yeah.
It was covered, and I don't think it's a surprise, in the Wall Street Journal, the nominally conservative paper. You received a write-up in the New York Times where they went out of their way to say, well, many of the others still say it was natural origin, and this doesn't vindicate Trump's racist conspiracy theories. And as you said, look, we know clear as day, the Times, their former reporter, Donald McNeil, literally came out and said that while he was over there, he didn't cover the lab leak because he didn't consider it credible. And it was only months later when he realized he'd been lied to and manipulated by Dr. Fauci, the scientific community, and Peter Daszak. I mean, it goes so deep. It really is Iraq WMD level. And let's not forget, it's not just about what we do. This thing, 1 million Americans died of COVID by some estimate. It caused trillions of dollars in economic damage. Like, the Iraq war, there's a lot of recriminations as to what happened after the invasion. But, what led up to the invasion was also very important. Yeah. Just like Vietnam, just like the Spanish-American War. Like, you have to go back and look at these initial conspiracies, cover-ups, and speculations and say, hey, how exactly did this shape what ended up coming, this catastrophe, so that we make sure that this doesn't happen again? I unfortunately do not think many people in the media will rescind that. All I have yet to see is the initial pushback is, well, actually, it's the conspiracy theorist's fault for making it a conspiracy, so that we had to dismiss it then at the time because they were liars and not credible. Maybe you're the liar. Maybe you're the one who's not credible.
Yeah, I mean, listen, fair enough that Trump did himself no favors, but you're a journalist. Yeah. You're not supposed to be playing favorites. You're not supposed to be like, well, I like this one and I don't like this one, so I'm going to go with the theory espoused by the person that I like. And that was exactly what was the reporter's name, Don McNeil?
Yeah, Don McNeil.
That was exactly what he said he fell victim to. It was basically like, I had long relationships with these scientists and people like Fauci. And so when they were like, no, it's natural origin, he just bought it instead of actually doing the research that you were supposed to do as a journalist and being skeptical of everyone, which is supposed to be, a core tenet ultimately of journalism. It really is remarkable to see how all of this unfolded and how it continues to unfold. I mean, the New York Times is a perfect example. When they got a report that said it looks like it's natural origin, which was based on, by the way, totally incomplete information, then it was news alert, front page, did the big, deep dive and made sure that they got it out to all their readers. Now that you have an alternative view, they'll put a little tiny blurb in there, but it's not getting nearly the same treatment that this, and they portray that also as much more conclusive and definitive than they're portraying this piece of evidence. So you can see their game. It's very clear. Hey guys, ready or not, 2024 is fully upon us now, and Saagar and I have been brainstorming ways that we can really up our game for this critical election.
Yeah, we rely on our premium subs to expand our coverage, to add staff, to upgrade the studio. We just want to give you the best independent coverage of this election, which is possible. So if you can help us out, become a premium subscriber today, breakingpoints.com, or the link is down here in the description video. It really means the world to us, and if you like what we're all about, this is the best possible way to keep us 100% independent, working only for you.